Good morning. I'm Andrew Orsatti, the Director of Communications for FIFPro. You should have your translation devices, please, if you could turn off all your phones, and also be aware that this is live on YouTube. I'd like to introduce you today to our delegation. Sitting next to me is Philippe Piat, who is the President of FIFPro, the General Secretary, Theo van Sechelen, and on the far side is Jonas Beer-Hoffman, who's FIFPro's Director of Policy. I would like to invite Mr. van Sechelen to open up today's press conference, and please, if you could, Theo, remember to switch on your microphone.
Thank you. Of course, so in my name, in the name of my colleagues, welcome. The first important message is that, but that is not new for you, is that FIFPro today has filed a legal action against FIFA in the form of a competition law complaint lodged with the Directorate General Competition of the European Commission in Brussels, challenging the global transfer market system governed by FIFA regulations as being anti-competitive, unjustified and illegal. Second, by targeting FIFA's regulations on the status and transfer of players, the so-called RSTP, FIFPro has asked the European Commission to explore the critical argument that the transfer regulations prevent clubs from fairly competing on the market to acquire sporting talent, harming the interest of players, small and medium-sized professional teams and their supporters. 3. The transfer system fuels and sustains increasing competitive and financial imbalance. It invites commercial abuse by third parties, owners and agents. And it fails to protect players against abuses of their labor contracts via systematic non-payment. Again, via systematic non-payment. 4. The harmful practice of clubs asking highly inflated transfer fees will also be looked at in this complaint. According to FIFPro, this represents an extreme barrier for clubs to compete fairly for playing talent, as the cost of fielding a competitive team is ever increasing. 5. The current system does not promote financial solidarity at all. Large parts of transfer fees circulate between the biggest clubs and leagues, but hardly trickle down to the smaller clubs and leagues. 6. From an economic perspective, the elite clubs use the transfer market to let the transfer fees escalate in order to maintain high barriers for other clubs to enter. 7. We need not to fear a football without the transfer system. As we all know, a lot of political leaders within football are saying that after Bosman, that Bosman was the one who is responsible for the failure of the system. But we think that, again, we need not to fear a football without a transfer system. We think that through collective bargaining, better labor market rules can be established, balanced fairly against the needs of clubs, together with an improved model of revenue distribution. We, of course, are also responsible to safeguard the future of football. Players have the sustainability of the game and industry at heart and will act responsibly. We have a duty to ensure jobs are secured for players, contracts are respected, and clubs financially viable to compete rather than just making up the numbers. This action is designed for the benefit of all, not only for the players, but also for the clubs, including the hundreds of millions of football fans who have been trained by the irresponsible administration of the transfer market. Thank you. And now I would like to give the floor to Philippe Piat, my colleague.
Merci Theo.
Thank you, Theo.
Now, I must remind you that we need to run over the history a little, and we need to look at the observations from the past. Previously, when FIFA lodged complaints with the European Commission, and when Theo was involved in these negotiations as well, this allowed me to to witness the events at the time. And so now I'd like to give you a bit of history. The European Commission, with its agreements with FIFA, said that some points had to be changed, particularly that solidarity among clubs had to be protected, that minors had to be protected as well, and the stability in terms of contracts, the balance for competition, and players having free access to civil courts. These were the main points that were requested from FIFA in order to change its regulations. But what has happened now? Well, at this stage in time, what we see is that there are unfair transfers. You saw that there was a Belgian player who was transferred for 80 million euros. And recently, you may well have heard from the president of Real Madrid saying that he would like to, if he wanted to sell Cristiano Ronaldo, it would cost 1 billion euros for the transfer. And then there are countries there are leagues in the east of Europe, in Latin America, where their players are not paid. Then football agents, transfer agents, are those who are guilty of unfair practices. And then we see with the TPO, we have companies that own the left leg of a player, another owning the head of a player, another owning the right leg of the player, and there is no stability in contracts. Each transfer window, you see that there are thousands of players changing from one club to another, so there is no stability in the contracts for players, and then there is no balance in terms of competition as well. The European Commission, what we see is that we always have the same clubs, the same large clubs at the elite, and the small clubs stay at the bottom. And then there is no protection for young players and minors. And there are clubs that own minors, but there is no protection provided for them. Then in Lausanne, there is a court which is supposed to issue rulings which are balanced and which help football, but actually we see that it is far from true. Then in terms of training fees, there is a decision from the Court of Justice on the 16th of March 2010 which regulates training fees for players. And despite the fact that this is a decision taken by the Court of Justice, it has not been applied. The European Commission also has some responsibility, given that it asks FIFA to change its rules, and we have the documents here. We see that the European Commission should ensure that all rules are respected, but this is not the case, and we can see that there are unfair practices taking place, and we as FIFPro want to ensure that all of this is modified, or at the very least, the spirit that drives the transfer system at the European Commission should be modified, since we have great concerns about the financial bubble that is being created, which could burst soon in the football transfer system, and we want to ensure that this is a system that is long-lasting. Thank you.
Maintenant, il est possible.
Now, we could also go into the details regarding particular points of how rules are applied nowadays. There is no solidarity between clubs, and my colleague here, Theo van Zegelen, said this just now. Often clubs say that the transfer system is necessary because the money of the rich will then filter down to the smaller clubs, but that is not the case. As you can see in economic studies, 67% of the money which is paid by large clubs in transfers goes back to just a few clubs at the top. So the money just stays among the elite, and a very little amount goes down and filters down to the smaller clubs. There is no freedom in terms of contracts, because after the the protected period for a player. That is what is supposed to allow stability for the player's contract, the player in his contract. But what we find is that this is not the case. If a player does not want to extend his contract, then there are immediate reprisals, and they are put on the bench or they are punished in one way or another until they are told, I will accept the conditions being imposed by the club, or I will simply fall in line with what is being imposed upon me. Now, I've heard from many players who have extended their contract for 3 years, and then at the next transfer window they're immediately sold off to another club. So how can this be the case? How can you have a working contract on the 15th of June and then 15 days later the player is sold off as soon as 15 days after the contract is signed? So we can see that the contracts have become a financial tool. We are seeing that players are being turned into commodities. They are no longer human beings. And this is getting out of hand. There are some stars who are incredibly wealthy, but then in small countries, in small clubs, you can see that there is almost slavery taking place. And then as for fees, the European Commission wanted players to be able to choose a court that they go to if they want to file a complaint against their club. Nevertheless, this system has fallen apart because the litigation chamber of FIFA, there we see that the president is not only not independent, but sometimes it takes 18 months, 2 years to give a ruling. And the FIFA rules outlined that the decisions, the litigation chamber decisions, have to be brought before the lawyers at the officials at Lausanne. All of this means that the measures in place and the spirit behind them, the measures that have been imposed in 2001 by the European Commission, we can see that they are no longer being respected and they are no longer fair. Therefore, FIFPro would like to make the situation much more acceptable. Thank you.
Jonas B. Hoffman will just pick up to just give you a quick insight into some of the technical aspects because there's been a great deal of also economic research that has been undertaken by Stefan Szymanski, who is a US-based economist who understands football finance extremely well. He's an author on the subject, and he helped to support the argument put forth to the Commission in this complaint with his document, and that together with the technicalities of the competition law argument. I'll just get Jonas to give you a quick insight into some of that.
Thank you indeed. Indeed brief, as a lot has already been said. Very briefly on the complaint, what has been established in previous decisions that FIFA can be seen as an association of undertakings, including its members. We have established in the complaint that this is association of undertakings via core components of the FIFA regulations on the status and transfers of players has allowed the re-establishment of a transfer market for players under contract. What is then argued is that these transfer fees represent a very, very high barrier of entry for clubs who are outside of the dominant group in a certain market, whether that's nationally or internationally, which disallow them to compete fairly with their competitors. At the same time, these restrictions impact the players' rights to position themselves in the market to the highest number of possible employers, because only a very few are able to actually bring about the fees that are required to acquire them. Now, based on this, we have established the markets that are impacted in this, and I think there's a big argument to be made here. Obviously, what is called the supply market on which clubs can compete for sporting talent, if this market is being anti-competitively restricted, it has an impact on various other markets, meaning primarily the sporting competitions themselves, and thereby the club's ability to be successful on other markets, including broadcasting rights, merchandise, sponsorships, etc., whereby they are disadvantaged not only in the form of being able to attract employees, but also to be able to sustainably build their clubs moving forward, because they simply don't have the chance to economically catch up to the dominant clubs in their markets. Now, As this is being explained in the complaint, it also represents, under Article 102, in our opinion, FIFA's imposition of these rules represent an imposition via an abuse of a dominant position in the market, which is very important, obviously, from a competition law perspective. On the economic side of this, also here a lot has been said. Mr. Szymanski, in his analysis, considers, I think, which is a very good image, the transfer fees as a tax on employment and a tax on mobility, meaning that they represent certain deterrences for possible employees to acquire, employers to acquire employee services. The compensation rules, which Philippe has spoken about, are considered an almost insurmountable barrier for the players to access the labor market, which is very critical. Now, what's important for this is that via these rules, as we've said, the dominant clubs in the market enshrine their position that they already established based on their financial superiority. By inflating the transfer fees more and more, they create higher and higher barriers for other clubs to compete with them to reach this highest level of competitiveness. And it is then seen in our economic analysis that the pro-competitive objectives that legitimized the system in its introduction in 2001 are not achieved. And as a matter of fact, we see very many negative side effects such as TPO, trafficking of minors, non-payment of salaries. Now, Philippe touched a little bit on the solidarity aspect, and one of the numbers there, 67% of transfer fees paid by clubs in the Big Five leagues are paid to other clubs in the Big Five leagues, which means that a huge part of the market is fragmentized, which benefits only in exchange, almost a zero-sum game between the biggest clubs where players and money is moved around, but very little of that is actually trickling down through the pyramid of clubs who feed the development of players. So clearly the solidarity aspect of this is very weak, and at the same time the solidarity mechanism that was introduced into the rules represents only 1.8% of overall transfer expenditure. So also this is a very limited aspect of when you consider a $3, $4, $5 billion market overall. There are a lot of other numbers which showcase how dominant these clubs have become. For example, the biggest three clubs in the five major leagues by now invest an average of 278 million euros to acquire their players. Meaning, if you're not able to pay up to that level on the transfer market, you will simply not be able to field a competitive team that can go to the championship rounds, that can go into the Champions League, and thereby bring in further resources. There's a lot of data there, which we are obviously also sharing in some of our releases, which showcase that the pro-competitive objectives of the system are not achieved, and thereby its legitimacy and its justification must be called into question.
Thank you, Jonas. Questions, please. Just one moment as we prepare the microphone. If you could raise your hand, remember to indicate your name, organisation, please, and to whom you are directing the question.
Hi. Is it working? Yeah. Hi, my name is James Crisp. I'm with Euractiv. I actually have two questions for all of you. If the transfer fees are brought down, isn't there a risk that the wages will simply go up and we'll just have a status quo situation? I think, yep, that's my question.
One point on this. The idea of solidarity, which justified the current system, was one of creating a certain degree of competitiveness and sustainability in a large number of clubs. Now, if we challenge that the transfer system is not achieving this, we're not challenging the principle of solidarity. We would like to actually achieve a higher level of solidarity, which allows more clubs to be more competitive, more sustainable, and therefore also offer better jobs for our players. Now, would that money that becomes free flow back into the market and ultimately some of it end up in wages? Probably yes, but the question is, do we put it in collective wages of all players, including those which are disadvantaged in Eastern Europe, Asia, Africa, etc., or do we only keep it at the highest end? And we're very much in favor of solidarity and creating new mechanisms which allow this money to be spread around to make a more viable and a more sustainable industry.
Can I add something with the experience a long time ago? Of course, that is the question which has been asked in our negotiations also by the clubs, and saying yes, after Bosman, they said the salaries exploded. And that will happen again if you if you abolish the transfer system. What happens after Bosman, in my opinion, is that after Bosman the salaries exploded because suddenly the clubs came to the conclusion that they have to do something to have the same influence and the same effects after Bosman. So they all signed long-term contracts with all kinds of players with huge salaries. That's also one of the reasons, in my opinion, why after a certain moment the clubs had financial problems, because not all these players coming from all over the world were playing and were good enough to play in their team. To come back to your question, we have, let's say, between 65,000 players, member of FIFPro. I have not seen every player in the last 30 years who said, I'm going to play for a club, but I don't want to play. In my opinion, a player has to play on the level where he belongs. You have good professional players and you have professional players who are a little bit less. My opinion is that if you are a professional player, you are a very good player. That we all know that. So at a certain moment, why should the clubs, the big clubs, have all the players? At a certain moment, the player wants to play, and it's not only about salaries. I'm 100% convinced that 99 of the 100 players wants to play football in the competition. So the idea that all the players are going to play for the 10 top clubs is almost impossible, because we have only 11 players on the pitch. So I think in the ideal world, every player is playing on the level where he belongs. And that means that also the player on the level where he belongs will have the salary which belongs to the level he is playing. And of course, as I said, if you really want to abolish the transfer system, then you also have to protect clubs and players. You have to come with a package of measures just to safeguard the future of football. So it's not that you, in an ideal world, you say, for instance, you also have to make the rules of agents stricter, otherwise they will have even more power. So it's not that we are saying that we're going to abolish the system and then we're going to wait and see. Absolutely necessary, in our opinion, is that we need to have a package of measures which safeguard the future. And I'm 100% convinced that if you're going to sit with experts for 1 week in one room, then you'll have these packets of measures.
Thank you for the follow-up. I mean, isn't there, if, say, for example, transfer fees do go down, isn't there then a risk that the status quo of the big clubs is just solidified? I mean, you're not going to have, say, a team like Manchester City, which got a lot of money, who were able to pay these larger fees and challenge the big four clubs in England, for example.
I think that's a similar answer. Now, do we believe that we can create an environment in which every club has exactly the same resources and exactly the same ability to compete? No, that's not the reality in any sport environment. But if we establish a structure by which these clubs can work more sustainably and have a certain security of what their resources and their budgets look like, we believe that they have a higher chance of working themselves into a competitive position via access to more resources, via broadcasting, etc., etc. So it's a matter of going also from a degree of very speculative management of clubs, which is certainly now the case, to a more sustainable model where they can actually build over time and have a certain degree of development, which allows them then to build up their competitiveness.
And if I may, don't forget that the market has changed. We see that football has become a global sport. That is quite clear. And of course, the television rights, if you compare that with 25 years ago, as also this market has changed. So even for that reason, the transfer system exists already 100 years. 100 years. And it was in 2001 for the first time that they tried to bring a balance between the application of European law on one side and the specificities of sports. But nobody is taking into account that the world has changed. And it seems to be, for us, quite logic, yeah, that you have to look at the current situation. We don't say that we wanted to avoid that we have top clubs in football. We always have top clubs because the better players are playing with the better clubs, and the better clubs normally have more income. That is not the question. The question is that the time that the player was playing in a small country with a small club, went then to another club in his country, a better club, and then at the age of 24, he was able to play for a top club in another country. That time is finished. That time is finished. And we also see that if you talk about the young players, education of young players, the time that the player played with his club to finalize his education up till the age of 22, 23, it depends on the quality of the player. You have to finalize your education as a football player if you play in the first team of a club. That time is also finished because now we see that players from 12, 13, 14 are already coming from all parts of the world. In Brazil and also in Uruguay, we know that all the players in the national teams under 17 and 21 are all playing in Europe. So we cannot deny that because of the fact that football is a global sport, yeah, we also have to look at the reality that that has consequences. And I don't know why, but we are not willing to face these facts. And that brings us in that situation, that we now have 35% of our players not being paid. And it brings us also in the situation that the small clubs, countries, still think that they can make money with transfers. That is not the reality anymore. And that is what we have to face, and we are very open to have a dialogue with the stakeholders to solve these problems. But it seems to be that they are not interested in it. Because we strongly believe in international competitions, but we also strongly believe that it is even possible in smaller countries to have an attractive national competition. And that balance has to be there. Otherwise, we are playing in a couple of years only with 30 clubs in the world. And that is not what we want. That is, in fact, not what nobody wants. And therefore, we have to act and prevent that happens, that we are talking about 30 clubs in the world and that we are losing the competitive balance, because the national competitions, in our opinion, are also still very important, even when they are in a different economic situation.
Je voudrais aborder.
Well, I'd like to bring up another point. At the moment, we're looking at the transfers, the regulations, and the balances that need to be brought in. But I would like to touch upon another point, and that is sports, the specificities for sports. You know that there is the Lisbon Treaty which speaks about this. And often sporting powers confuse specificity and sporting exceptions. And in the name of this specificity, they think that they're doing the right thing. But in football, we have a legal no man's land, because there is no respect for workers in the world of football, and they give themselves large. They say that they can use any measures that they like in order to address the financial situation. But we should look at society. We should look at the impact on the players themselves. We should look at the impact on the wider public. And all of this is forgotten about, because the system requires investment. It requires economic, financial measures to be respected first and foremost, and the actual rights of citizens and players is not respected. So football should not come before the law. Thank you.
Good morning. what you said about Brazilian players and excuse me, South American players moving to Europe at a very young age, people might say that that might not change with the abolition of transfer fees, because the reason they move to Europe is because they're promised higher wages and better living standards. How would not having transfer fees, could you explain how that would change by not having transfer fees?
I would like to ask you a question. Why do you think that in South America people who own these players are bringing these players to Europe? What is the reason for that? Why should you bring a player of 16 years old to Europe? Why should you do that? You do that because you want to exploit the player and you think that you can make money with this player. So the reason why they are playing in Europe is because the owners or the agents, most of the time the agents are the owners of the players. They bring them here because they want to exploit them. Yeah? They want to make money with them. Because I cannot imagine that a kid from 16 years old is leaving his Paris and his country because he wants to play in whatever country where it is always raining, or to East Europe. So that is it can only be the reason is that they want to make money with it, and if not, then these kids can go home disappointed. So that is the reason, and I think that is also for all kinds of moral reasons, not what we want. These kids has to grow up in their own country and have education, of course, also over there. So if you do not have a commercial interest, then you will not bring these kids to Europe anymore.
Just to add a more broad point on this, what's important to understand also is that under the current system, practically every player has a price tag assigned to him, whether it's through the transfer value, whether it's through third-party ownership, whether it's even to training compensation and other rules. And thereby we've established a market on which these players are traded as assets, as commodities. And through that, there has been the creation, with more and more money flowing in, of a side economy of third-party owners, of people trafficking minors all through the continents, because they have the incentive of possibly monetizing that action through a transfer fee paid later on. So we also must bear in mind that this situation, of course, looking forward and what we will have afterwards is important, but the situation right now is pretty bad. So it's also to bear in mind that we have to first of all see how we can stop the abuse and what are the sources of this abuse. And if we see that there's a structural deficit within the system that creates that, then we must tackle that.
Yeah, Pablo Rodriguez, El Mundo. I have 3 short questions, if I may. What's the reaction of the European Commissions when you have in touch? Did you get any feedback from them before just fulfilling? The second one is, what do you want? I mean, is a system without transfers at all, in which players can leave any kind of club of contract within 15 days or months, depending on the country's legislation? Or can you elaborate a bit on the specifics? And at the same time, I don't get the link between the thousands and thousands of unpaid players you talk about and the transfer systems. Could you elaborate a bit on that? Which the link between those factors?
Maybe quickly on the technical side, I don't know if somebody else wants to then fill in. From the Commission side, obviously we had very thorough discussions with them about this. I think the Commission, as much as probably anybody in this room, recognizes that this system at the moment is not functioning the way it ought to be. Arguably, had the Commission foreseen what this would look like 15 years later, I would question whether they would have gone ahead with the same kind of an agreement. But the Commission, I believe, also recognizes that because of the 2001 process and this informal agreement, they have a shared responsibility in addressing the system. So we have a positive outlook at the Commission's openness to these questions. On the non-payment, 2 points. First of all, respect of contracts was one of the objectives that actually legitimized having the system. So clearly, if it fails to achieve that, it fails to achieve one of its core objectives, which allows it to be in present. Second argument to that is, under Article 17, the consequences of a breach of contract are being prescribed. And on the side of a player breaching a club, these are very drastic, while at the side of a club breaching the contract with a player by not paying them or other forms, they're hardly noticeable. The consequences would be the compensation in principle would be the rest value of the contract. But this has to be mitigated by the earnings that the players would make with another club over the duration of the contract. Plus the player would have to go probably into a multi-year process in an arbitration procedure to even get that money paid. So the system doesn't prevent, arguably incentivizes clubs to non-payment. It certainly fails to fulfill its objective to stabilize these contracts and ensure that players are being paid. And I think it's important to keep in mind the system had objectives which legitimized it working, let's say, a little bit next to the regular rules in the law. So if it doesn't fulfill these, then it has lost its justification. On the what do you want, I think that's a big question. Clearly what I would say is that the players are not unreasonable. They understand how this industry functions, and they will not simply go ahead and create an environment in which they can play for 5 teams in one season. So I don't know, Theo, if you want to fill in on that, but it's clearly not one where we just want to do away with the rules and every player can do whatever they want without any balanced and for especially collectively bargained labor market regulations that are fair and that are equal in the rights and responsibilities for both parties.
Yes, just to add, your question is, of course, a reasonable one. How do you see then the future if you change the system? If you receive that in the pyramid, you see that we also have to admit that in the world of football, we really need not only a reform process in good governance, but I don't want to touch that subject, but we also really need to have a real reform in relationship to professional football. It is quite clear that clubs and players are the one who has to have a role in this, in finding solutions for these problems. And I give you some simple solutions. The clubs and players do not have any involvement, by the way, in the governing body. So we are in committees, but we have a limited influence. But I'm sure that if clubs and players are sitting together, I give you a simple example. Why is it not possible after 15 years to implement in professional football a minimum standards of a contract? Why do we still need to work with different contracts in countries where we even do not accept labor contracts? What is simpler than that to make a collective agreement and to implement this minimum requirement so that every player has a standard contract in which all his financial benefits are mentioned? Why is it not possible to make between the clubs and players rules about agents? Why is it not possible strict rules? Yeah, so that we at least prevent that a third part of the transfer of the income of transfers are going to agents or to people outside football. I think that if you really would like tools, why? Of course, we are open to discuss other measures to protect professional football. The problem is that nowadays, with all respect, FIFA has 209 members and UEFA has 53 members. What really is necessary is that we are making a distinction between the amateur football and professional football. We don't want to have a closed system as they have in the United States, but at least it must be possible to have within the governing bodies a separate division of professional football, and that means clubs and players. Because presidents of the governing bodies within and without Europe must not dictate what professional football has to do. As Philippe said, what we want is a balance between the specificity of sports on one hand, but also respect of European law in this case on the other hand. And we are not asking so much. So I don't be negative or pessimistic that after a world without a system or with an improved system, football will have damage of it. It's a matter of making the right decisions and making collective agreements which has to be respected by clubs and players, yeah, on the worldwide level.
Je voudrais ajouter quelque chose.
There's one point I'd like to add. As you've seen, what I'm mainly interested in is the rights of players and the rights of citizens. And Jonas gave you an overview of this, but I'd like to give you quite a shocking example of the imbalances that exist, particularly Article 17 on transfers. Now, you know what Article 17 is about. It's about solving the problem when a club and a player, when one or the other decides to split. If it's the player that decides to break away from the club, then it's a working contract. As you know, a working contract has rules between an employer and an employee, which need to be respected. If a player unilaterally decides to break his contract, he is then is punished by receiving a drop in his salary, and then any transfer fees that may have been given to him may no longer be given to him. And then there are other rulings which go against him and other sanctions. And it's the player who suffers all of these sanctions if he decides to break his contract. But now, let's take another example. Well, the same player, the same club, but it's the club that decides that they want to break the contract. Well, it's quite simple. They just send a letter saying, sorry, we're breaking this contract, and the player will simply have to leave. And there may be complaints that may be filed, and after 18 months or 2 years, then the player may finally win the court case. But it's such a long period, and he doesn't receive the payments that he was due during this period. And what's the sanctions for the club? Well, the club is sentenced to pay the remaining salary for the period in which the player was not playing. And in English, they say less. So it's the remaining salary minus what they would have got at another club. So if a player is being paid 10,000 and the club decides to break the contract, and then if he has 10,000 at the next club, then the difference between the two is one minus the other, so it's zero in the end that the player receives. So when there's a huge difference, if the player decides to break the contract, then he has severe sanctions against him, but the club has almost gets away scot-free. And so we can see that this is a situation that cannot last.
2 more questions, please. 1, 2. Thank you.
Christian Oliver from the Financial Times. Just on the 2 of the things you'll have to establish. One on whether transfer fees are highly inflated. This is the sort of subject that the Commission prefers to look at the structure rather than prices. They don't like these arguments about this number is too big. They want the actual structure of the system. Are you going to use any methodology with them to actually talk about what is an excessive price for these sort of transfers? They prefer to look at the structure. So just on that, a similar sort of question. If you're going to look at the transfer window, what is the sort of methodology you're using there to say, we're getting these big prices because of the structure, because of the window, that this definitely, it's a difficult counterfactual argument. What would happen if there weren't the window and there was open trading? It comes back to the same sort of James' question. What would happen otherwise? So, I mean, how do you establish those? The high prices are unjustified, and that the window causes the price escalation.
If I may, we can assist you as well afterwards, Christian, with a bit more of a technical aspect of your question, and I'll invite Jonas to jump in on one of those points, but you can also come to us afterwards and we'll help you out there.
Yeah, I was going to go there the same way. I think the lawyers are in the room who will maybe be able to give you a little bit more detail on all the facts. Now, with regards to whether you consider transfer fees inflationary, I think the first thing is if you track the development and if you track them according to the major landmark developments in the industry, 95 Bosman 2001 agreement, etc., you see that their development is beyond exponential. So that's the first indication that there is no healthy rationale behind it. Also in the complaint, we cite various sources actually from some of the other industry stakeholders who try to describe the idea of market value. And their documents themselves establish that these are objective and subjective, measurable and unmeasurable. So basically, when they try to explain these market values with, I'm sure, a lot of expertise, they themselves have to reach very deep into terminology that tries to explain them, and a lot of it is subjective. So I would argue, on the other way around, I think there is no way to explain the market value that they apply from their end as to what that actually means. So I think there is a lot of that in the competition law complaint, which I'm sure we can give you a little bit more detail. But that's the rationale which they apply, and that suggests where it is. Now, on the windows, I think it's similar. But what you clearly see, obviously, also in the development of traffic over the course of a window, you see that the vast majority of these deals are being made closer and closer to the deadline. And closer to the deadline, they inflate in their value. So I think also there you just see the pressure that it puts on the market through the limitation by the window. You see that it has an impact on the traffic, which I think to some degree is caused by fan expectations. You have to make a deal because your team is not good enough. But also how this deadline puts pressure on them to probably overpay even under irrational justifications.
Last question, please.
Hi, Lewis Crofts from MLEX. Just two questions. One general one. Why now? It seems to me, 2001 was when is your measuring stick, which is when the rules had their last kind of review. It seems to me that if transfer prices were particularly high this year, but they were high last year and the year before and the year before and the year before. So why now? Secondly, perhaps a more technical question. I'll try it, even though the lawyers are in the room. You said, Jonas, that you said that FIFA was acting, you thought, as an association of undertakings, which it probably means that they're sort of in cahoots with the big clubs, and that they all benefit from the system at the moment. That's actually a 101 argument. It's basically a cartel argument. But then you go on to say FIFA is a dominant undertaking imposing these rules. Which is it? Is it a cartel, or is it a monopoly, or is it both?
Yeah, I'm willing to answer the first question, and Jonas, you will answer the second one. It's a good question. Why now? You have to go back a little bit in the history when we were negotiating in 2000 the new regulations, because as you all know, in 1998 the European Commission, pushed by us, came with a declaration of objectives. That means that they forced FIFA to implement the Bosman ruling. It took another couple of years, but in these negotiations we thought, but we have all the details about that we could find a balance between the specificities of sports and, as I said before, the application of European law. That, in fact, was the intention also. If you look at the press releases from the European Commission, when they made suddenly a deal with, on the political level with Blatter, Johansson, the former president of UEFA, Blatter, at that time already, he was the president of FIFA, and Tony Blair from England and Schröder from Germany. And as we call it, at that moment, we were left alone. And in football terms, we said we were tackled from behind. We standing outside the door. And then we went to court already in Brussels, in this place, and we had a court case for more than 1 year and a half, and so it was already in 2002 that after a real request of the European Commission, because they wanted to have us on board, we accepted the 11 famous 11 points under the condition that we should evaluate it if it should work. Now, then we are talking already about 2004 and 2005, where we had the discussions to change a little bit the regulations. That's not too much. But in fact, the real reason why it took so long is that we still try to find a solution within the football family. I know that Karl-Heinz Rummenigge always is saying, and also all the people involved in football, you have to solve your problems within the football family, and I fully agree on that. There is no any reason not to do it, but you have to realize that we already for 4 or 5 years, seriously trying and to find a solution for the problems who were already there 4 or 5 years ago. But unfortunately, we even can find a solution at this moment, that is the reality, for the non-payment of players. And I always said, maybe you'll maybe sign the labor contract, and I'll say that to all the people involved in football, is it normal that players are not being paid? But even on that subject, we do not find an agreement. And even if we are going to discuss this, then they say, if you want to have the guarantee of payment of players, then you have to give us in the negotiation some other things. Now, we think that to pay the salaries is a fundamental right of every worker, so why should we negotiate that? So it seems to be that the clubs, and maybe even you could understand that if you're working for a club, thinks that they want to maintain the status quo. And we, the delay, because we had to do it, I admit it, already a couple of years before, but we still had at least the feeling that they really would like to come to an agreement with us. On the January 23 of this year, when we discussed the overdue payables, we came to the conclusion that there was no reason to continue the negotiations, which we didn't up till today. By the way, already 3 years ago, we started within the organization this project. So already 3 years ago, we came to the conclusion that if we fail to negotiate a better result, then we have to take legal action. So it's not an excuse, but we really thought in good faith that we could find a solution within the football family. Unfortunately, that is not the case.
So, first of all, it's good to see that we have some people here who dig deep on the legal side of things, because that will make sure that the people in DG Competition also find the stories in the columns that they like to read, not only the sports pages. Definitely, I think there's room for discussion of this with the lawyers afterwards, and it probably makes sense. Now, the main argument of the complaint evolves around Article 101, and FIFA and its members as an association of undertakings having put in place these rules, which are anti-competitive to the advantage of certain people in the market. At the same time, any player who wants to compete in this industry needs to be registered with some federation and some club, and needs to sign a licensing agreement, and as well in his employment contracts he needs to abide by the rules of the federations. If he doesn't do that, he practically can't perform his job. There is no secondary market in which he could offer his services where he wouldn't be subject to these rules. So FIFA being in a position of basically having a monopoly over professional football can impose these rules on the players, and if we consider them to be anti-competitive to the benefit of a certain group of clubs, and definitely not to the interests of our members, then we see that as an abusive use of that market position. Further details I think we should discuss afterwards.
And on that note, I would like to say thank you all for your participation today.